I used to think a cheap suit just earned you disrespect. But that night, my dad's bargain outfit became the perfect trap. They mocked his crooked stitching and scuffed shoes, unaware they were signing their own sentence. When the boardroom doors burst open moments later, the man entering was not a country bumpkin. He was the one holding the final key to their entire empire. My name is London Gray. I am 29 years old, and for the last 3 years, I have been living a life that looks immaculate on Instagram, but feels like suffocating under a layer of high-thread count linen. To the outside world, I am the lucky woman who married Graham Layton, the heir apparent to the Layton Harbor Group, a real estate and hospitality dynasty that owns half the skyline of Chicago. To the inside world, specifically the one inhabited by my in-laws, I am a decorative object that occasionally speaks out of turn. They think they bought me when Graham put the ring on my finger. They think I am just a girl from the South Side who got lucky. They are wrong. The wind off Lake Michigan was particularly cruel that afternoon, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows of our apartment. It was a sound I had grown used to, a low and constant threat that something was trying to get in, or perhaps that something was trying to get out. I stood by the glass, looking down at the gray water, tightening the belt of my cashmere robe. It was a gift from my mother-in-law, Vivian. She always gave gifts that were soft to the touch, but heavy to carry. My phone buzzed on the marble countertop. It was not a text from my husband asking how my day was. Graham rarely asked that anymore. We had drifted into a polite coexistence, like two roommates who shared a bed and a tax bracket but little else. No, this was a summons. The message was from Vivian's personal assistant, a woman who likely had not slept more than 4 hours a night since 2010. Dinner tonight. Layton Tower. 7 o'clock sharp. Attendance mandatory. Family discussion regarding future ventures. I stared at the screen. Mandatory. The word hung there, stripping away any illusion of choice. Usually, family dinners were scheduled weeks in advance, coordinated with the precision of a military strike. A same-day summons meant panic. It meant crisis, or it meant an ambush. Then the second text came through, followed immediately by a phone call. I picked up, keeping my voice even. "London," the assistant said. She did not say hello. "Vivian wanted me to clarify the dress code. Formal. And she emphasized that your father is included in the invitation." My stomach tightened. "My father?" "Yes, Mr. Wells is required. Please ensure he is dressed appropriately. We have investors coming in later in the evening, and Vivian was quite specific. She does not want him to embarrass the family. Make sure he understands the gravity of the setting." The line went dead before I could respond. I lowered the phone, my knuckles white. My father, Frank Wells, was a retired railway mechanic. He had spent 40 years fixing engines that pulled thousands of tons of steel across the country. He had grease permanently etched into the lines of his palms. He was a man of few words, and even fewer pretenses. He owned exactly one suit, a charcoal gray two-piece he had bought at a department store outlet 10 years ago for a funeral. He kept it in a plastic garment bag at the back of his closet. He was the most honorable man I knew, and the Laytons treated him like a stain on their silk upholstery. Why did they want him there? Vivian tolerated Frank at weddings and holidays, usually by placing him at the table furthest from the center, hoping he would blend in with the catering staff. Inviting him to a strategy dinner at the headquarters was unprecedented. It felt wrong. It felt like a setup. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my mind racing. I needed to understand the landscape before I walked onto the battlefield. I unlocked my iPad and logged into a secure server, bypassing the benign interface of a recipe app to get to my real work. The Laytons thought I spent my days shopping, organizing charity galas, and waiting for Graham to come home. They thought my degree was just a piece of paper I framed to look smart at cocktail parties. They had no idea that for the past 2 years, I had been working as a senior risk analyst for Northline Advisory. It was a remote position, highly confidential, dealing with corporate restructuring and fraud detection. I spent my days dissecting the financial health of companies that looked invincible on the outside, but were rotting on the inside. I knew how to read a balance sheet like a roadmap. I knew that when a company started cutting corners on compliance, they were usually 6 months away from implosion. I had never looked at the Leighton Harbor Group files. It was a conflict of interest, and frankly, I wanted to keep my two worlds separate. But today, the air felt different. I opened a separate browser window, one I used for monitoring luxury asset liquidations. It was a habit from work. When the wives of board members started selling their jewelry, the company was usually in trouble. It was the canary in the coal mine for the ultra-wealthy. I scrolled through a private auction group for Chicago's elite. There it was, posted 3 hours ago. Patek Philippe Grand Complications, vintage, mint condition, seller motivated, cash only, same-day transaction preferred. The username was anonymous, hidden behind a generic avatar, but I recognized the watch immediately. It was Graham's grandfather's watch. Vivian had made a show of locking it in the family vault 2 years ago, claiming it was too precious to wear. She had called it the Heart of the Legacy. Now she was selling the Heart of the Legacy to a stranger on the internet for quick cash. I zoomed in on the photo. In the reflection of the watch face, just barely visible, was the distinct pattern of the wallpaper in Vivian's private study. She had taken the photo herself, likely in a hurry. The asking price was $200,000. It was worth at least $300,000. She was desperate. The smell of desperation is distinct. It smells like sulfur and heavy perfume trying to mask sweat. Vivian Leighton never did anything without a calculated reason. If she was liquidating assets in secret, the Leighton Harbor Group was not just struggling, it was drowning. And suddenly, the invitation to my father made sick, twisted sense. They did not want Frank there to share in a celebration. They did not want his advice. They needed something from him, or worse, they needed someone to blame. I thought about Graham. My husband had been distant lately, coming home late, smelling of scotch and anxiety. He would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, his shoulders hunched. When I asked him what was wrong, he would just say it was market volatility. I had believed him, or maybe I had just been too tired to dig deeper. But Graham was weak. He loved the lifestyle his parents provided more than he loved the truth. If Vivian told him to jump, he would ask how high. If Vivian told him to throw his wife to the wolves to save the company, would he do it? I looked at the text message again. Discussion regarding future ventures. I closed the iPad and stood up. The coldness inside me was no longer from the Chicago wind. It was a steel door slamming shut on my emotions. I had spent 3 years trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law. I had bitten my tongue when they made subtle jabs about my background. I had smiled when Sloane, my sister-in-law, asked if my father could fix her car during Thanksgiving dinner. I had played the role of the grateful commoner allowed into the palace, but they had made a mistake. They thought they were inviting a sheep to the slaughter. They forgot that I was Frank Wells' daughter. My father taught me that you measure twice and cut once. He taught me that a machine only breaks when you ignore the grinding noise for too long. I went to my closet and pushed aside the pastel dresses Vivian liked me to wear. I reached for a black dress, sharp and structural. It was armor. I called my father. He answered on the second ring. London. His voice was warm, grounding. I could hear the background noise of his workshop, the hum of a radio. Dad, I said, keeping my voice steady, did you get a call from Graham's office? I did, he said, sounding amused. Fancy dinner? Said I needed to wear a suit. I dusted off the old gray one. Hope the moths haven't had a feast. Dad, I said, and I had to pause to keep my voice from trembling. They are going to be rude tonight. They are going to be cruel. I need you to promise me something. I'm a grown man. London, I can handle a few snobs. I know you can, but this is different. I think they are in trouble, and I think they are going to try to use us. There was a silence on the other end. Then the sound of a wrench being set down on a metal bench. Use us how? I don't know yet, but please, just trust me. Whatever they say, whatever they do, just hold your ground. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything until I look at it. London, he said. his tone shifting from fatherly to serious. I didn't work double shifts for 30 years so my daughter could be scared of people who have never changed a tire. I'll be there, and I'll wear the suit. If they don't like it, they can look at the wall. Okay, I whispered. I love you, Dad. See you at 7, kiddo. I hung up. I stood in the middle of my silent, expensive apartment. I looked at the luxury furniture that belonged to a brand, not a home. I looked at the wedding photo on the mantel, Graham and I smiling a smile that didn't reach our eyes. I went back to the iPad. I opened a secure messaging app and typed a message to my superior at Northline Advisory. Need a full liquidity run on Leighton Harbor Group. Immediate priority. Flag for potential insolvency and off-book liabilities. I suspect asset stripping is already in progress. I hit send. If they wanted a war, they were going to get one. I was not going to let them humiliate my father. I was not going to let them strip him of his dignity to patch the holes in their sinking ship. I walked into the bathroom and began to apply my makeup. I made my eyeliner sharp enough to cut glass. I put on the diamond earrings Graham gave me for our first anniversary cold, hard stones that glittered without warmth. I thought about the assistant's warning, "Don't let him embarrass us." A dark smile touched my lips in the mirror. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who had just found the loose thread that could unravel the whole tapestry. My father would walk into that room in his cheap suit, with his calloused hands and his honest eyes, and they would mock him. They would underestimate him. They would see a retired mechanic. They wouldn't see the man who taught me that the loudest part of the engine is usually the part that is about to fail. I grabbed my clutch. I checked my phone one last time. No reply from Graham. He was probably already there, receiving his briefing from Vivian, learning his lines for the play. I took the elevator down to the garage. I didn't take the chauffeured car they sent. I drove my own car. I wanted to be the one behind the wheel tonight. As I merged onto the highway, heading toward the glittering spire of Leighton Tower, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I was London Grey. I was a risk analyst. I was a hunter in a silk dress. They invited us to dinner because they thought we were food. In a powerful family, an invitation is never just an invitation. The private dining room on the 50th floor of Leighton Tower was not designed for eating. It was designed for intimidation. The walls were paneled in a dark, endangered wood that probably cost more than my father's entire pension fund, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Chicago that made the cars below look like insects. It was a view meant to make you feel like a god, or at the very least, a king. But as I walked in, my heels clicking against the marble threshold, the room did not feel like a sanctuary of power. It felt like a courtroom. The table was a long slab of black granite, cold and reflective. It was set for 5, but the spacing was deliberate. At the head sat Vivian, the judge. To her right sat Graham, the reluctant witness. Across from him was Sloane, the prosecutor. And then there were the 2 seats at the far end, separated from the rest of the family by a subtle but significant distance. That was where they had placed me and my father. I pulled out my chair. It was heavy, upholstered in velvet, but as I sat down, I realized it was positioned slightly off-center from the place setting. It forced me to twist my torso just to face the center of the table. It was a petty, microscopic aggression, the kind Vivian specialized in. It was a physical reminder that I did not quite fit, that I was slightly askew in their perfect geometry. My father arrived exactly at 7 o'clock. The heavy double doors opened, and Frank Wells stepped inside. He paused for a moment, taking in the room, his eyes scanning the space with the same practical assessment he used when looking at a faulty transmission. He was wearing the suit. The charcoal gray fabric was clean, pressed within an inch of its life, but the cut was boxy, a style from 2 decades ago. The shoulders were too stiff, creating a ridge that made him look broader and more rigid than he actually was. His shoes, black leather Oxfords that he had polished at the kitchen table that morning, shone under the chandelier light, but the creases across the toes betrayed their age. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who worked with his hands, trying his best to show respect to people who had none for him. "Good evening," my father said. His voice was steady, carrying easily across the expanse of the room without needing to be raised. Vivian did not stand. She merely tilted her head, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Frank, you found the service elevator all right?" It was a test. I knew for a fact the main elevators required a keycard he did not have, forcing him to use the freight entrance. "The ride was smooth enough," my father replied, ignoring the barb. He walked to the chair next to me and sat down. He placed a napkin on his lap, his movements slow and deliberate. Graham looked up then, and for a second, our eyes met. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened slightly, which was uncharacteristic for him, and his face had the pale, clammy sheen of someone who was waiting for a bomb to go off. He forced a smile at my father, but it was a grimace. He quickly looked down at his water glass, tracing the rim with a shaking finger. He knew the script. He knew what was coming, and his silence was his signature on the warrant. Sloane did not bother with fake smiles. She was tapping away on her phone, the light illuminating her surgically perfected cheekbones. She dropped the device onto the table with a clatter that echoed in the silence. She looked my father up and down, her gaze lingering on the lapel of his suit where the fabric was slightly worn. "Interesting choice, Frank," she said. Her voice was light, airy, and laced with arsenic. "I haven't seen a cut like that since I watched old news footage from the 90s. Where did you pick that up? Is there a discount outlet that specializes in vintage costumes?" My spine stiffened. I opened my mouth to speak, to cut her down, but my father's hand rested gently on my forearm under the table. His skin was rough, warm, and calloused, a silent command to hold fire. He looked at Sloane, his expression unbothered. "I bought it a long time ago," he said simply. "It is clean, and it keeps me warm. That is all a suit needs to do." His refusal to be embarrassed seemed to irritate her more than if he had snapped back. To Sloane, clothes were armor and currency. To hear someone dismiss them as merely functional was almost blasphemous. "It is certainly distinct," she sneered, picking up her wineglass. "Though I suppose in your line of work, you don't really need to worry about presentation. Grease stains probably blend right in with that color." Vivian cleared her throat, a sound like dry leaves crinkling. "Now, Sloane, be polite. Frank does the best with what he has. Not everyone understands the language of presentation." She turned her gaze to me, her eyes cold and reptilian. "It is like that little lesson we tried to teach London last year about table settings. You remember, don't you? Dear one cannot simply buy taste. It has to be bred." She took a sip of her sparkling water. "I was just telling my friends in the Hamptons last weekend, we were at the Vanderbilt summer opening, that it is so difficult these days to find people who appreciate the nuance of heritage. Everyone wants to rush. Everyone wants to pretend they belong in rooms they haven't earned." She was not talking to my father anymore. She was talking to me. She was telling me that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much money I made, I would always be the mechanic's daughter. "Speaking of earnings," Vivian continued, her voice dropping to a conversational purr that was far more dangerous. "Frank, London tells us you are fully retired now. That must be tight. I hope you aren't finding the city too expensive. We would hate to see you forced to move out to one of those sad little suburbs further south." "I manage," my father said. He picked up his water glass. "My needs are simple. I own my house. I have no debt. I sleep well at night." "No debt," Graham muttered, almost to himself. It was the first thing he had said. He sounded envious. "Graham," Vivian snapped, cutting him off, "pour the wine." As the dinner progressed, the atmosphere grew heavier, like the air pressure dropping before a tornado. But amidst the insults and the posturing, my analyst brain began to pick up on things that did not fit. The room was opulent, yes. The view was expensive, but looking closer, the facade was cracking. The floral centerpiece was massive, white lilies and orchids, but the petals on the side facing away from Vivian were browning at the edges. They were not fresh. They were at least 4 days old. The Leighton standards required fresh flowers daily. Then the first course arrived. A lobster bisque, usually. A dinner at Leighton Tower was served by a team of 3: a sommelier, a head waiter, and a server. Tonight, there was only one man. He looked harried, his forehead glistening with sweat as he tried to clear plates and pour wine simultaneously. He was rushing, his movements lacking the invisible grace of high-end service, and then I saw it, the silverware. I looked at the spread of cutlery on the black granite, fork, knife, spoon, but something was missing. The small, distinct silver spoon usually reserved for the palate cleanser was gone. The set was incomplete. I looked at the tablecloth. It was brand new, stiff with starch, likely to cover the fact that the table underneath might be scuffed, or perhaps to hide the fact that they were using a different table altogether because the original one had been sold. But the missing spoon was the tell. In high-end hospitality, you do not lose a piece of a silver service. If one piece goes missing, you replace the set. You do not set a table with gaps unless you physically cannot afford to replace it, or unless the vendor who rents you the silver has put you on a credit hold and you are scraping by with what you have left in the storage closet. Vivian Leighton, the woman who just bragged about the Hamptons, was serving dinner with an incomplete silver set. The realization hit me in the chest. They were not just in trouble, they were insolvent. They were maintaining this entire theater production on fumes. My father finished his soup. He wiped his mouth with the linen napkin, ignoring the way Sloane was watching him like he was an exhibit in a zoo. "Excuse me," Frank said, standing up. "I need to use the restroom." Sloane let out a short, high-pitched laugh. "Oh, careful, Frank. The hallway is long and the doors all look the same. Try not to get lost in the building. We would hate to have to send security to find you wandering in the boardroom." "I have a good sense of direction," my father said. He pushed his chair in. "I usually know exactly where I'm going, and I know exactly where the exits are." He walked out of the room, his back straight, the heels of his old shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor. As the door closed behind him, the silence in the room shifted. It became predatory. Without the outsider present, the Leightons turned their focus entirely on me. Vivian sighed, a long, dramatic exhalation. "Honestly, London, I do not know how you stand it. The polyester fumes alone are enough to give one a headache, but I suppose it is quaint, in a rustic sort of way." I gripped the stem of my wine glass. I gripped it so hard I thought the crystal might snap in my hand. I looked at the browning flowers. I looked at the missing spoon. I looked at Graham, who was staring at his reflection in the black table, looking like a man awaiting execution. They were puffing their chests out. They were sneering at a man who had built a life with his own 2 hands, a man who owed nothing to anyone. They were mocking his suit while they sat in a tower they could no longer afford to heat. They thought they were the lions playing with a mouse. I took a sip of water to cool the burning in my throat. I looked at Vivian, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a powerful matriarch. I saw a woman terrified of the dark. Laugh all you want, I thought, the anger crystallizing into something sharp and cold in my chest. You are laughing at the only person in this building who can actually pay his bills. They had no idea that while Frank was walking down the hall, he wasn't just looking for a restroom, he was looking at the cracks in the walls that they were too busy preening to see. "He is a good man," I said quietly. "Goodness doesn't buy equity, darling," Vivian said, signaling the waiter to pour more wine. "Now, let us talk about why we are really here. We have some paperwork to discuss before dessert." The trap was springing. I could hear the click of the mechanism, but they had forgotten to check if the prey had teeth. The waiter placed the dessert in front of me. It was a deconstructed lemon tart, a smear of meringue and a crumble of crust that looked more like an accident than a confection. It was fitting. Everything about this evening was a beautifully plated disaster. My father had not yet returned from the restroom. His absence left a void at the end of the table, a space that the Leightons were eager to fill with their own agenda. The air in the room had shifted from passive aggression to active maneuvering. The pleasantries were over. We had reached the transactional phase of the meal. Vivian reached into her handbag. A crocodile skin Hermes that probably cost more than my first car. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and slid it across the black granite table. It stopped inches from my water glass. "London," she said, her voice dropping to that reasonable, maternal pitch she used when she was asking you to do something unreasonable. "Before we get to coffee, there is a small matter of housekeeping. Just some family paperwork, standard procedure for the new fiscal year." I looked at the envelope. It was unsealed. I looked at Graham. He was staring at the centerpiece, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle feathering under his skin. He knew what this was. He had probably known for days. "Housekeeping?" I asked, my voice neutral. "Just updates," Sloane chimed in, picking at her dessert with a fork. "Compliance stuff. We all have to sign them. Keeps the lawyers happy." I picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy, textured. I pulled out the document inside. It was stapled, about 10 pages thick. I skipped the cover page and went straight to the definitions section. My eyes scanned the text with the speed and precision of a machine. I had spent the last 5 years reading contracts that tried to hide toxicity behind Latin phrases. I knew exactly what I was looking for. This was not housekeeping. It was a post-nuptial agreement. But it was not just a standard separation of assets. It was a scorched earth policy. I turned the page, my finger tracing the lines. Clause 4, Section B, Waiver of spousal support. Clause 6, Section A, Retroactive classification of marital assets. They were reclassifying everything Graham had acquired during our marriage as sole and separate property of the Leighton Trust. And then I found the teeth. Clause 9, Non-disclosure and non-disparagement. It was standard to have an NDA in a high-net-worth family, but this one was different. It had a liquidated damages provision. If I were found to have shared confidential information regarding the financial state of the Leighton family or their businesses, or if I engaged in conduct that damaged the reputation of the Leighton Harbor Group, I would be liable for a sum of $5 million. It was a trap, a legal noose. "This is a postnup," I said. Looking up, I kept my face blank, masking the shock. "And a retroactive one at that." "It is a protection mechanism," Vivian said, waving her hand dismissively. "London, you are a modern woman. You work somewhere, doing something with data. Do you not? You understand brand protection. The market is volatile. We need to insulate the core assets from any personal liabilities. It protects you too, in a way." It did not protect me. It stripped me naked and left me standing in a blizzard. I looked at Graham. "Did you read this?" He finally looked at me. His eyes were wide, glassy. There was no malice in them, only a profound, paralyzing fear. It was the look of a boy who had broken a vase and was waiting for his mother to find the broom. He was not worried about my future. He was worried about his own survival. "It is just for the bank, London," Graham murmured. "They need to see clean lines. It is just paper." "It is never just paper, Graham," I said softly. I flipped to the back page. There was an addendum, tucked away in smaller font. Indemnification. If I signed this, and if the Leighton Harbor Group faced any regulatory fines due to internal mismanagement that could be linked to household negligence, a term so vague it could mean anything, I accepted full financial responsibility. They were not just cutting me out. They were setting me up. They were building a firewall. And I was the brick they intended to burn. "I will need to take this home," I said, starting to fold the document. "I will have a lawyer look it over." Vivian's smile vanished. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That will not be necessary," she said, her voice turning brittle. "Our family counsel, Mr. Sterling, drafted it. He is the best in the city. Bringing in an outside lawyer would just complicate things. It implies a lack of trust. London, and we are family." "It is standard practice to have independent counsel for a postnup," I countered. "Otherwise, a judge could throw it out for coercion." There is no coercion here, Sloane snapped. Just sign the damn thing. London, stop acting like you have leverage. You are marrying up. Remember, this is the price of admission. My phone buzzed in my lap. One short vibration. I glanced down, shielding the screen with the edge of the tablecloth. It was a notification from the encrypted messaging app we used at Northline Advisory. The sender was Jay, my lead forensic accountant. Update on LHG. They just hit the watch list. Moody's is downgrading them at midnight. I see a massive transfer of debt liabilities to a holding company called Redwood Proxy. Be careful. This looks like a bust-out scheme. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my breathing remained slow and even. A bust-out scheme. It was a classic, dirty maneuver. You load a company with debt, sell off the valuable assets to a secret entity you control, and then let the original shell company collapse into bankruptcy, leaving the creditors and anyone else unfortunate enough to be attached to it holding the bag. The postnup made sense now. They weren't trying to protect the brand from me. They were trying to sever Graham from the blast zone. If I signed this, I would be waiving my right to see the financials during a divorce. I would be signing an NDA that prevented me from testifying about their lifestyle versus their reported income. And that reputation damage clause, that was the insurance policy. If the company went down and the press started digging, they could blame the disgruntled lower-class wife for leaking rumors, sue me for $5 million, and distract the public while they ran away with the money. They were not just divorcing me. They were monetizing my destruction. I looked up at Vivian. She was watching me with the patience of a spider that knows the fly is already stuck. I understand the urgency, I said, lying through my teeth. But $5 million in liability is a lot for a school teacher's salary, or a risk analyst's. It is a deterrent, nothing more, Vivian said smoothly. We never expect to use it, unless, of course, you plan on betraying us. Betrayal is a strong word, I said. I looked over at Graham again. He had placed his phone on the table, face up. A message flashed on the screen. He was too distracted by his own misery to notice I was reading upside down. Subject: emergency board session. Time: 9 o'clock in the morning. Location: executive boardroom A. Agenda: change of control. Creditor demands. 9 o'clock. That was the deadline. That was why they needed the signature tonight. They needed to present a consolidated front, or a liability shield, to the board tomorrow. They needed to show the creditors that the family assets were locked down and untouchable. I felt a cold rage settle in my gut. It was different from anger. Anger is hot and messy. This was clarity. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was a girl who was impressed by the view and the tablecloths. They thought my father was a fool in a cheap suit who was currently lost in the hallway. They didn't know that my father wasn't lost. He was likely walking the perimeter, counting the security cameras, checking the exits, observing the staff, and they didn't know that I had just received confirmation that their empire was built on a sinkhole. I need a pen, I said. Sloane smirked triumphantly. She reached into her purse and tossed a heavy, gold-plated Mont Blanc pen across the table. It spun on the granite and came to a rest in front of me. Smart girl, Sloane said. I picked up the pen. I held it in my hand, feeling its weight. You know, I said slowly, looking at the nib, my father always told me that you should never sign a contract in a room where you are the only one not smiling. I looked around the table. No one was smiling anymore. However, I continued, uncapping the pen, if it is for the family. I lowered the pen to the paper. Vivian leaned forward, her eyes hungry. Graham flinched, looking like he wanted to stop me but lacked the courage. I didn't sign my name. Instead, I wrote 2 words on the signature line. In clear, block letters. Under review. Then I closed the folder. I will have my lawyer send this back to Mr. Sterling by noon tomorrow, I said, sliding the folder back toward Vivian. After I've had a chance to read the appendices you forgot to attach. There were no missing appendices. I made that up. But the panic that flashed across Vivian's face told me everything I needed to know. She didn't know what was in the legal binder. She hadn't read it. She just knew she needed a signature. That is not acceptable, Vivian hissed. her mask slipping. "We need it tonight." "Why?" I asked, tilting my head. "Is something happening tomorrow morning, say, around 9 o'clock?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a heart skipping a beat. Graham dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against his plate. Vivian stared at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. For the first time tonight, she looked at me not as a nuisance, but as a threat. "You are pushing your luck, London," she whispered. "And you are sweating, Vivian." I replied calmly. "Your powder is cracking." At that moment, the heavy double doors opened again. My father walked back in. The timing was impeccable. He looked refreshed, calm, and completely out of place in the tense atmosphere we had created. He walked to his chair, sat down, and looked at the uneaten lemon tart. "Nice place you have here," Frank said, breaking the tension with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Although I noticed something interesting in the hallway. Sloane rolled her eyes. "Oh God, what now? Did you find the janitor's closet?" "No," my father said. He looked at me, a small, knowing glint in his eye. "I saw a man carrying a box of files out of the archive room, seemed in a rush, dropped a paper. I picked it up for him." Vivian went rigid. "He was very polite," my father continued. "Thanked me. Said he was working late for the transition." My father didn't know what transition meant in a corporate context, but I did, and Vivian did. It meant the end. I looked at my father, and I realized he wasn't just making conversation. He was signaling me. He had seen something real. He had seen the rats fleeing the ship. I looked back at the post-nup lying between us. The weapon they had tried to use against me was now a dud. "I think we will skip coffee," I said, standing up. "Dad, are you ready to go?" "Sit down," Vivian commanded. It was a bark, desperate and loud. "We are not finished." "Oh, I think we are," I said. I picked up my clutch. "The dinner is over, Vivian, but don't worry, I have a feeling we will be seeing a lot of each other tomorrow." I didn't know exactly what the morning would bring, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to be the victim in their tragedy. I was going to be the witness for the prosecution. And tomorrow, when those boardroom doors opened, they weren't going to like who was standing on the other side. The silence that settled over the table after I refused to sign the post-nuptial agreement was heavy enough to crush a lesser man. But my father simply picked up his fork and took a small, deliberate bite of the lemon tart. He chewed slowly, looking out the window at the dark expanse of the city, completely immune to the venomous glares being shot his way by the Leighton women. Watching him there, sitting amidst the crystal and the malice, I was suddenly pulled back to a memory from 20 years ago. I was 9 years old, sitting on the workbench in our garage, swinging my legs while my father rebuilt a transmission. He was wearing a pair of coveralls that had been patched so many times they were more thread than fabric. I had asked him why he didn't buy a new pair. I remembered the smell of the grease and the specific, metallic tang of the air. He had wiped his hands on a rag and looked at me. "London," he had said, "cloth is just cloth. It tears. It stains. It burns. You don't put your money into things that rot. You put your money into your head and your hands. Those are the only things the bank can't repossess." He lived by that code with a religious fervor. He drove a truck until the wheels literally fell off. He fixed his own plumbing. He never took a vacation that required a plane ticket. But when I got into University of Chicago, he walked into the bursar's office and paid my first semester's tuition with a cashier's check. He didn't take out loans. He hated debt. He called it slavery with a smile. Don't you ever beg for a seat at someone else's table. He had told me the day he dropped me off at my dorm, "If they don't let you in, you go out back. You chop down some wood, and you build your own table, and you make sure it is stronger than theirs." I looked at the Leightons. Their table was made of imported granite, but it was mortgaged to the hilt. My father's table was imaginary, but it was paid for. Vivian could not stand his silence. It was an affront to her authority. She needed him to be cowering. She needed him to feel the weight of his inferiority so she could feel the buoyancy of her superiority. "Frank," she said, her voice sharp and testing. I suppose you don't see desserts like this very often. It is a deconstructed Meyer lemon tart. The chef was flown in from Paris. My father swallowed the last bite. He placed his fork down, parallel to his knife, perfectly aligned. It is sour, he said, but it clears the palate. Vivian's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward, the diamonds at her throat catching the candlelight. She decided to abandon subtlety. She wanted blood. You know, Frank, looking at you tonight, I feel a sense of pity. It must be hard for London to see the contrast. We have tried to elevate her, to polish the rough edges, but then you walk in here looking like yesterday's news. She gestured vaguely at his suit. A man of your age should know better. In our world, appearance is currency. If you look cheap, people assume you are cheap. You really should learn to invest in your appearance. It is a sign of respect for the company you keep. Graham looked down at his lap, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Sloane smirked, enjoying the show. My father turned his head slowly to look at Vivian. His expression was not angry. It was not hurt. It was the look a parent gives a toddler who has just thrown a tantrum in a grocery store, a mix of patience and disappointment. I invest. Vivian, he said. His voice was low, resonant, filling the room without shouting. I just don't invest in things that fade with the season. I invested in my daughter's education. I invested in my home. I invested in my word. When I shake a man's hand, he knows I'm good for it. I don't need a $3,000 suit to prove I have value. Usually, the people who spend the most on the wrapper are the ones trying to hide that the box is empty. The room went dead silent. It was a direct hit, a precision strike. He had called out their entire existence, the empty box wrapped in expensive paper, without raising his voice or using a single curse word. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed. Her face turned a patchy, indignant red. She looked like she had been slapped. How dare you? Sloane hissed, leaning forward. You are a guest here. And I have finished my meal, my father said. He pushed his chair back and stood up. He buttoned his jacket, that stiff, boxy jacket that suddenly looked like armor. London, I think it is time we let these good people get back to their business. They seem to have a lot of paperwork to sort out. He looked at me, and his eyes were clear. Let's go. I stood up immediately. I will walk you out. Dad? London, sit down, Vivian commanded, her voice trembling with rage. We are not finished with you. I am finished for tonight, I said. I will be back in the morning to discuss the housekeeping. I didn't wait for permission. I grabbed my clutch and walked around the table, joining my father. We walked toward the double doors, side by side. I could feel the eyes of the Laytons burning into our backs, but I didn't turn around. I felt a strange surge of pride. For years, I had been ashamed of my background in their presence, trying to blend in, trying to hide the grease and the grit. Now, walking next to him, I realized that the grit was the only real thing in the room. We exited the dining room, and the heavy doors clicked shut behind us, muffling the sounds of the inevitable explosion that was happening inside. The hallway was quiet, lined with abstract art that looked like violent splashes of paint. We walked to the elevator bank in silence. I pressed the call button and watched the numbers descend. Dad, I said softly. My voice shook a little. I am so sorry. I shouldn't have let you come here. I knew they would be like this. I didn't think they would be this vicious. My father turned to me. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from my forehead, a gesture he hadn't done since I was a little girl. London, he said, don't you ever apologize for the rudeness of others. That is their shame to carry, not yours. They showed me exactly who they are, and that is a valuable piece of information. The elevator chimed and the doors slid open. It was empty. We stepped inside, and the mirrored walls reflected us, me in my designer dress, him in his outlet suit. We looked like strangers, but we stood like allies as the doors closed, sealing us in. My father turned to me. His face lost its softness and took on a look of intense, calculating focus. It was the face he wore when he was diagnosing a complex engine failure, listening for the rhythm that didn't belong. "London?" he asked. "Are you busy at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning?" I froze. My hand hovered over the button for the lobby. I turned to look at him, confused. 9 o'clock, I repeated. That was the exact time of the emergency board session I had seen on Graham's phone. That was the deadline. "Why do you ask?" I said, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "I have a meeting," he said simply. "Here, in this building. I would like you to be there with me. I think you might find it interesting." I stared at him. "You have a meeting with who, Dad? You are a retired mechanic. What kind of meeting could you possibly have at Leighton Tower at 9 in the morning?" He didn't answer immediately. He just adjusted his cuff, pulling the sleeve of his shirt down. "Like I said, London, I invest in things that don't fade. Sometimes, those investments mature in unexpected ways. Just tell me, can you be there?" "Yes," I stammered. "I have to be here anyway. They want me here." "Good," he said. "Then I will see you at the front desk. Do not come up without me." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the cold marble floor of the entrance hall. The security guard at the desk looked up, bored. Before we could step out, a voice echoed from the hallway we had just left, seemingly transmitted through the elevator shaft, or perhaps just carrying down from the mezzanine above. "London." It was Vivian. She must have followed us to the landing, or perhaps she was calling down from the railing of the atrium. Her voice was shrill, desperate, echoing off the stone walls. "London. Don't you forget 9 o'clock tomorrow. You must be present with the family. We need a united front." I stepped out of the elevator, my father right beside me. I looked up toward the high ceiling where her voice was coming from. "I hear you, Vivian," I called back. Not caring who heard me, I looked at my father. He gave me a small, tight smile. "United front," he muttered. "That is a funny way of saying human shield." He walked toward the revolving doors. The cold Chicago wind was waiting for us outside. But for the first time that night, I didn't feel the chill. I felt the heat of anticipation. "Go home. London," my father said as we reached the curb. "Get some sleep. You are going to need your sharpest eyes tomorrow." "Dad," I asked one last time, desperation creeping into my voice. "What is going on? What do you know?" He turned to look at the massive, illuminated logo of the Leighton Harbor Group above the entrance, the light reflected in his eyes, making them look hard as flint. "I know that a man who builds his own table doesn't have to worry about anyone pulling the chair out from under him," he said. "And tomorrow, London, we are going to do some furniture rearranging." He turned and walked away into the night, heading toward the subway station, his shoulders square, his step light. I watched him go until he disappeared around the corner. The dinner had been a nightmare. The insults had been brutal. But as I walked to my car, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating. The dinner wasn't the main event. It wasn't even the appetizer. It was just the bait. And the Leightons, in their arrogance, had just swallowed the hook whole. I watched my father disappear into the darkness of the Chicago streets, his stride rhythmic and unbothered by the wind. For a moment, I considered running after him, abandoning my car, abandoning the Leightons, and just vanishing into the anonymity of the subway system. But escape was not a strategy. It was a surrender. And as I turned back toward the golden light spilling out of the lobby of Leighton Tower, I knew that surrender was no longer an option. I had barely taken 2 steps toward the valet stand when a hand clamped around my upper arm. It was not a violent grip, but it was firm, possessing the manic strength of a woman who was used to stopping traffic with a raised eyebrow. "We are not finished, London," Vivian said. Her voice was no longer shrill. It was low, dangerous, and stripped of all the social graces she usually plastered over her venom. "I think we are," I replied, trying to pull my arm free. "I am going home." "You are going nowhere until you understand the reality of your position," she hissed. She steered me forcibly away from the glass doors and toward a set of mahogany doors adjacent to the security desk. This was the Founders Lounge, a room reserved for private board discussions and high-stakes intimidation. Vivian pushed the doors open and practically shoved me inside. The room smelled of old leather and stale cigar smoke, the scent of deals made by men who were long dead. She closed the door, sealing us in. "Sit down," she commanded. I remained standing. "I prefer to stand. What is this about?" "Vivian, the dinner is over. The show is over." "The show is just beginning," she said, pacing the small Persian rug in the center of the room. She looked frazzled. A strand of hair had escaped her lacquered updo, hanging limp against her cheek. It was the first flaw I had seen in her appearance in 3 years. "You think you were clever upstairs? You think refusing to sign that postnup was a victory? It was a suicide note. If the company is solvent, Vivian, then my signature shouldn't matter tonight," I said, testing her. "If Leighton Harbor is as strong as you say, a post-nuptial agreement can wait a week. Why the panic?" Vivian stopped pacing. She turned to me, and her face was a mask of exhausted rage. "Because there is no week. London, there is only tomorrow." She walked over to a wet bar in the corner and poured herself a glass of scotch. Her hands shaking so badly the crystal decanter clicked against the glass. She drank half of it in one swallow. "We are restructuring," she said, the word tasting like bile in her mouth. "The market has been unkind. The hospitality sector is shifting. We have some liquidity issues. Temporary, but severe." I crossed my arms. "Liquidity issues? Is that what you call selling family heirlooms on the internet?" She froze, the glass halfway to her mouth. Her eyes snapped to mine. "You know about the watch." "I know enough," I said. Vivian set the glass down with a heavy thud. "Then you know we are vulnerable, and that is why you are going to help us. You are going to sign that agreement, and tomorrow morning, you are going to stand next to Graham in that boardroom. You are going to smile. You are going to look adoring. You are going to be the face of stability." "And why would I do that?" I asked. "You have spent the last 3 years making me feel like an intruder. Now you want me to be the mascot." "Because we are offering you a trade," she said, her voice smoothing out, regaining some of its manipulative cadence. "You want validation, fine. We will give it to you, if you help us navigate this transition, if you help us secure the confidence of the board tomorrow. I will appoint you to the board of directors for the Leighton Charity Foundation. It is a titular role, of course, but the prestige is immense. You will be rubbing shoulders with senators, with heiresses. You will finally belong." I almost laughed. A seat on a charity board. That was her carrot. She was offering me a glossy title in exchange for signing away my legal rights and becoming a human shield for their financial incompetence. "You want me to be the distraction," I said flatly. "You want the press to look at the happy young couple while the creditors strip the assets in the background. I want you to do your duty," Vivian snapped. "Do you think this life is free? Do you think the clothes on your back, the apartment you live in, the air you breathe in this city just appears? It is paid for by the brand, and right now, the brand is under attack." "By who?" I asked. "Who is attacking you, Vivian? Or is the call coming from inside the house?" She stepped closer, invading my personal space. I could smell the expensive alcohol on her breath. "It does not matter who," she whispered. "What matters is the banks. What matters is the men in that boardroom tomorrow. They smell blood. If we do not show unity, they will trigger clauses that will wipe us out. They will take the tower. They will take the house in the Hamptons. They will take everything." She was terrified. It was not just greed anymore. It was the primal fear of an animal cornered in a trap of its own making. "Why is it happening so fast?" I pressed. "Restructuring takes months. Why is tomorrow 9 o'clock the deadline?" "Because of the acceleration clause," she blurted out, and then immediately looked like she wanted to swallow the words back down. I stared at her. An acceleration clause. In a commercial loan. That was the death knell. It meant the lender had found a breach of contract, a missed payment, a falsified report, a drop in collateral value, and was demanding the entire loan amount be paid back immediately, not in monthly installments, all of it, at once. "You breached a covenant," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Which one was it?" "Debt to EBITDA ratio cash reserves." Vivian glared at me, hate burning in her eyes. "You are smarter than you look. London, that is unfortunate. Intelligence is not a desirable quality in a daughter-in-law. Obedience is—" Her phone rang in her clutch. She snatched it up, looking at the screen with panic. She held a finger up to me, silencing me, and answered. "Yes," she said, turning her back to me. "No, I told you. The papers are being handled. No. Do not speak to the proxy yet. Listen to me. We cannot afford a covenant breach on the public record. If the news gets out before the market opens, the stock will tank. Yes, I know about the accelerated repayment demand. I am handling it. Just keep the lawyers stalled until 9. She hung up, breathing hard. She turned back to me, composing herself. "Go home, London. Talk to Graham. He is waiting for you by the car. But remember this, if the ship goes down, you drown too. There are no lifeboats for people like you." She walked past me and exited the lounge, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble, leaving me alone in the scent of stale smoke. I walked out of the lounge, my mind racing. Accelerated repayment, covenant breach. They were not just restructuring, they were being foreclosed upon. I found Graham standing by my car in the valet circle. The wind was whipping his coat around his legs. He looked small. He looked like a paper cutout of a man. "London," he said as I approached. He reached for my hand, but I kept my arms crossed. "Your mother just offered me a seat on the charity board if I agree to let you rob me," I said. Graham winced. "It is not robbery. London, it is protection. Look, I don't want you to be dragged into the mess. If you sign the postnup, you are clear. You walk away with nothing. Yes, but you walk away clean. If you stay attached, the creditors might come after you too." "Is that what she told you?" I asked. "Or is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night?" He looked at me, his eyes wet. "You don't understand. They are going to crush me. London, if I don't deliver your signature, if I don't get the family to look united, Mom said she would cut me off. Completely. I don't know how to be anything else but a Leighton." "You could be a man," I said. He flinched as if I had struck him. "I am trying to save us," he pleaded. "Please, just play the part tomorrow. Just for one morning. Then we can figure it out." I looked at him, and the last shred of affection I held for him dissolved. He wasn't malicious. He was just weak, and in the world of high-stakes corporate warfare, weakness was more dangerous than malice. A malicious enemy you can predict. A weak ally will let the enemy in the back door because they are too scared to lock it. "I will be there tomorrow, Graham," I said, opening my car door. "But I am not playing a part anymore." "Yimash." "Did you sign the papers?" he asked, hope flaring in his eyes. "I signed something," I said. "I'll see you at 9. I got into the car and drove away. I didn't look back. As soon as I was on the highway, heading north toward the cleaner air of my own neighborhood, I activated the voice command on my phone. "Call Jason." Jason was my counterpart at Northline Advisory. He was a night owl, a man who lived for data dumps and forensic accounting. "London." His voice came through the speakers, sounding surprised. "It is 10 o'clock. You usually don't call unless the building is on fire." "The building is burning, Jason," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "I need a favor, and I need it off the books." "I'm listening." "Leighton Harbor Group. I need the full debt structure, not the public filing. I need the real one. I need to know who holds the primary lien on the headquarters and the hotel chain. Vivian mentioned an accelerated repayment demand. Someone called the loan." "Accelerated repayment." Jason whistled. "That is nuclear. Give me 20 minutes. I will have to dig into the UCC filings and maybe cross-reference with some shadow banking databases. If it is that bad, they probably sold the debt on the secondary market. Just find me the name, Jason, I need to know who is holding the knife. On it. I hung up. The drive home felt like it took 3 days. When I finally walked into my apartment, the silence was absolute. Graham wasn't there. He was likely staying at the tower or at his mother's penthouse, getting his marching orders. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked straight to the kitchen island and opened my laptop. The screen glowed blue in the darkness, illuminating my face. I logged into my secure email. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then a notification pinged. Subject LHG debt analysis. Urgent. From Jason. I clicked the email open. There was a single PDF attachment. I downloaded it. The document was dense, a spiderweb of shell companies and offshore holdings. I scrolled past the initial layers of obfuscation, past the Cayman Island fronts and the Delaware LLCs. I was looking for the ultimate beneficiary, the entity that had purchased the distressed debt from the original bank, the entity that had pulled the trigger on the acceleration clause. I found it on page 4. Primary creditor, via assignment. Redwood Proxy LLC. The name meant nothing to me at first. It sounded like generic corporate filler, but then I looked at the address associated with the LLC. It wasn't a skyscraper in Manhattan. It wasn't a P.O. box in the Virgin Islands. It was a small, nondescript commercial address in a strip mall in Gary, Indiana. My breath hitched. I knew that zip code. I knew that street. I opened a second tab and typed in the address. Google Maps brought up a grainy image of a small, brick building. A sign above the door read, Miller Associates, Small Business Law. It was a tiny, 2-person law firm, the kind that handled wills, traffic tickets, and small estate planning. Why would $1 billion debt be held by a shell company registered to a strip mall lawyer in Gary, Indiana? And then, a memory flashed. A Sunday afternoon. 3 years ago, I was visiting my father. We were sitting on his porch. He was reading a letter from a lawyer. "Who is that from?" I had asked. "Just an old friend," he had said, folding the letter. "Dave Miller. We served in the Navy together. He's helping me set up a little retirement fund. Nothing fancy. Dave Miller, Miller Associates." I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. Redwood Proxy LLC. Redwood, my father's favorite tree. He had planted one in the backyard the day I was born. He said it was the only thing that grew straight and tall no matter how bad the storm was. The room seemed to spin. The Laytons thought they were being attacked by a faceless bank. They thought they were fighting the market. They were wrong. The debt wasn't held by Wall Street. It wasn't held by a hedge fund in London. It was held by a shell company that led back to a 2-bit lawyer who was best friends with a retired railway mechanic. I sat back in the dark kitchen, the laptop screen the only source of light. I put my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. Vivian had said, "We are under attack by men in the boardroom." She had no idea. She wasn't under attack. She was under judgment, and the gavel was going to fall at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The blue light of the laptop screen was the only thing illuminating my kitchen, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble countertops. I was no longer London Gray, the submissive daughter-in-law. I was London Gray, senior risk analyst, and I was staring at a digital crime scene. The file Jason had sent was not just a debt structure. It was an autopsy of a company that had been dead for months, kept moving only by the galvanism of fraud and denial. I poured myself a black coffee, the steam rising into the cold air of the apartment, and began to dissect the corpse of the Layton Harbor Group. The first thing that jumped out at me was the acceleration notice. It was dated 30 days ago, in corporate finance. An acceleration notice is the nuclear option. It is a formal demand from a lender requiring the borrower to repay the entire outstanding balance of a loan immediately because a specific term of the contract has been breached. The Laytons had not just missed a payment, they had triggered a covenant default. I scrolled down to the specifics. The debt in question was a massive syndicate loan, originally underwritten by a major commercial bank, totaling $250 million. It was secured by the 3 crown jewels of the family empire, the Layton Tower itself, the flagship Harbor Hotel in Chicago, and the private estate in the Hamptons. This was where the trap lay. The assets were cross-collateralized. It meant that the Laytons had linked everything together. If they defaulted on the hotel, they lost the tower. If they lost the tower, they lost the house. It was a house of cards glued together with arrogance, and someone had just pulled the bottom card. But why lenders usually prefer to rework a loan rather than foreclose, especially with a high-profile client? Foreclosure is messy. It is expensive. Unless the lender suspects that the borrower is lying to them. I opened the folder labeled Revenue Audits. This was the data Jason had scraped from the shadow accounts. The numbers looked perfect. Too perfect. The occupancy rates for the Harbor Hotel had held steady at 85% for the last 4 quarters, even though the hospitality industry in Chicago had dipped to 60% during the winter months. The Laytons were claiming to outperform the market by a margin that was statistically impossible. I dug deeper into the accounts receivable ledger. I found a recurring series of bookings originating from a shell company called Apex Horizon every month. Apex Horizon booked 300 rooms at the full rack rate. The invoices were marked as paid. But when I cross-referenced the payment origin, the money wasn't coming from an external client. It was being circled back from a Layton subsidiary. They were taking money from their left pocket, putting it into their right pocket, and calling it revenue. This was not creative accounting. This was securities fraud. They were inflating their revenue to keep their loan covenants in compliance, to trick the banks into thinking the business was healthy. And then I found the smoking gun. It was an archived email chain attached to the audit file, likely leaked by a disgruntled accountant who saw the writing on the wall. The subject line was Q4 occupancy targets. The sender was Sloan Layton. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the words of my sister-in-law. To General Managers, from Sloan Layton, Director of Brand Strategy, date November 12th. The quarterly numbers are unacceptable. If we show a dip below 70%, the credit line freezes. I do not care how you fix it. Create the bookings. Use the marketing reserve fund to cover the cost. We need heads in beds. Or at least, we need the system to think there are heads in beds. Make it happen by Friday or find new jobs. I sat back, the breath hissing out of my lungs. Sloan had put it in writing. She had ordered her staff to falsify occupancy records to defraud the lender. This was the breach. This was why the loan had been sold. The original bank must have smelled the rot, panicked, and sold the debt at a discount to get it off their books. They sold it to a distressed debt buyer. They sold it to Redwood Proxy LLC. I switched tabs back to the corporate registration for Redwood Proxy. I looked at that address in Gary, Indiana again, the small law office of Miller & Associates. My mind raced back to my father, Frank Wells, the man who clipped coupons, the man who drove a 20-year-old truck, the man who fixed his own roof. I had always assumed his frugality was a necessity. I assumed he lived simply because he had no choice. But looking at these numbers, a different picture began to form. A picture of a man who had worked in logistics and mechanics his whole life. A man who understood how systems worked. My father had never been a simple laborer. He was a man who understood value. He had spent 40 years taking his paycheck and putting it into things that grew. He didn't buy new cars. He bought land. He didn't buy designer suits. He bought municipal bonds. He didn't talk about money. He compounded it. And he had a friend named Dave Miller who was a lawyer. It wasn't just that my father knew the person holding the debt. My father was the debt. He must have bought the distressed note. When the bank panicked and unloaded the latent debt for pennies on the dollar to recoup their losses, my father, or rather, Redwood Proxy, had stepped in and bought the paper. He had bought the mortgage on their entire lives, and because he held the note, and because he had proof of the fraud Sloan had committed, he had every legal right to call the loan. He wasn't being cruel. He was executing a standard foreclosure on a fraudulent borrower. He had trapped them with their own lies. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. The noise sounded like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. I looked at the screen, a text message. Sender Dad. Time 2:45 in the morning. Message. Be there on time. Don't be afraid. Just watch the door. I stared at the words. Don't be afraid. For 3 years, I had been afraid. Afraid of Vivian's judgment, afraid of Sloane's mockery, afraid of Graham's weakness. I had made myself small to fit into their world. I had apologized for my father's existence. I felt a flush of shame so hot it burned my cheeks. I had underestimated him just as much as they had. I had looked at his cheap suit and seen poverty. I had looked at his silence and seen submission. But he hadn't been submissive. He had been patient. He wasn't poor. He just didn't need to prove he was rich. I looked back at the laptop. I had the evidence. I had the email from Sloane. I had the circular payment records from Apex Horizon. I had the proof that the Laytons were not just bankrupt. They were criminals. I was no longer a helpless spectator. I was a witness with a loaded gun. I opened a new document. I began to compile the dossier. Exhibit A, the fraudulent bookings. Exhibit B, the Sloane-Layton directive. Exhibit C, the insolvency report. I organized the files with the cold precision of the analyst I was born to be. I printed them out. The printer hummed in the background, a rhythmic, mechanical sound that felt like a war drum. I stapled the document. It was thick, heavy. It felt like a brick in my hand. I thought about the post-nup Vivian had tried to force me to sign. I thought about the titular role on the charity board. I thought about the missing spoon and the dying flowers. They wanted me to be a prop. They wanted me to stand in the boardroom and smile while they lied to the creditors. They didn't know the creditor was going to be sitting at the head of the table. And they didn't know that the prop was bringing the evidence that would bury them. I closed my laptop. The kitchen plunged back into darkness. Save for the blinking light of the printer, I walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, in a modest house with a paid-off mortgage, my father was sleeping soundly. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't drinking scotch to calm his nerves. He was resting, because he knew something the Laytons did not. He knew that money talks, but wealth whispers, and tomorrow morning, the whisper was going to turn into a roar. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was the absence of weight. The heavy blanket of the Layton expectations had been lifted. I wasn't alone anymore. I had the most powerful ally in the city. I went to my bedroom. Graham was still not home. The bed was empty. I laid out my clothes for the morning. Not the soft pastels Vivian liked. I chose a navy blue suit. Sharp. Professional. The kind of suit a woman wears when she is coming to work, not to a tea party. I set my alarm for 7 o'clock. I lay down in the dark, my hand resting on the dossier on the nightstand. Let them have their secrets. Let them have their pride. Tomorrow, the numbers were going to speak, and numbers, unlike the Laytons, never lied. The lobby of Layton Tower at 8:45 in the morning was a cathedral of capitalism. It was a cavernous space of white marble and glass, designed to make anyone earning less than 7 figures feel physically smaller. The air was filtered, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, and smelled of ozone and expensive cologne. It was a space I had walked through 100 times, but today, with the heavy dossier pressing against my side inside my tote bag, it felt different. It felt like a gladiatorial arena. I stood near the south pillar, watching the morning rush. The Layton family was already assembled near the private elevator bank, a cluster of tension wrapped in Italian wool. Vivian was wearing a cream-colored suit that likely cost more than my father's truck. She was typing furiously on her phone, her thumb hitting the glass screen with a violence that betrayed her composure. Graham stood next to her, looking pale and nauseous, adjusting his tie every 30 seconds. Sloane was checking her reflection in the polished brass of a decorative planter, ensuring her mask was perfect. I approached them, my heels clicking on the stone floor. Vivian looked up, her eyes scanning me for flaws. "You are late," she said, though I was 15 minutes early. "Traffic," I lied. "I am here now." "Good," Vivian snapped, shoving her phone into her purse. "Now, listen to me. When we get upstairs, you say nothing. You sit in the chair behind Graham. You cross your legs. You look attentive. If anyone asks you a question, which they won't, because you are irrelevant to the financial structure, you simply smile and look at Graham. Do you understand? You are scenery. London, try to be decorative." "I understand my role, Vivian," I said. keeping my voice flat. "I hope so," she muttered, smoothing her lapel. "Because if this goes sideways, we all go down, and I will make sure you land the hardest." She turned back to the elevator, tapping her foot. Then, the revolving doors at the main entrance spun slowly. My father walked in. He was wearing the same charcoal suit from dinner, in the harsh, natural light of the morning. The fabric looked even more worn. The sunlight hitting the lobby floor revealed the slight shine on the elbows and the faint fuzzing of the material at the cuffs. He was carrying nothing, no briefcase, no phone, no files, just his hands at his sides, walking with an easy, rolling gait that belonged on a workshop floor, not in a billion-dollar headquarters. Sloane spotted him first. She let out a short, incredulous laugh that echoed off the marble. "Oh my God," she giggled, nudging Graham. "Look, he actually came. I thought he was joking. Look at him. Graham, he looks like he is here to fix the plumbing." Graham didn't laugh. He looked at my father with a strange expression, confusion mixed with a creeping dread. "Why is he here, Mom? You said the invite was just for dinner." "I have no idea," Vivian hissed, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe he thinks there are leftovers." My father approached the security turnstiles. These were not simple gates. They were high-tech barriers manned by a team of 3 guards who looked more like private military contractors than concierges. They were trained to stop anyone who didn't look like they owned the building. Frank Wells definitely did not look like he owned the building. The lead guard, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, stepped out from behind the podium. He held up a hand, his palm flat, a universal gesture of stop. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his voice booming slightly. "Deliveries are around the back. This entrance is for executives and authorized personnel only." My father stopped. He didn't look intimidated. He didn't look angry. He just looked at the guard with a calm curiosity. "I am not making a delivery," my father said. "Do you have an appointment?" the guard asked, his tone dropping an octave, becoming more aggressive. He scanned my father's outfit, his eyes lingering on the scuffed shoes. "This is a secure building. If you don't have a pass, you need to leave," Sloane whispered loudly to Vivian. "This is humiliating. Should we call security to have him removed before the investors see him?" "Let him fail," Vivian whispered back, a cruel smile touching her lips. "It will be a good lesson for London." I started to step forward, my instinct to protect him flaring up, but then I stopped. I remembered the text. "Don't be afraid." My father reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The guard tensed, his hand drifting toward his belt. My father pulled out a small, rectangular card. It wasn't a standard visitor pass. It wasn't paper. It was a heavy, matte black card with a single silver strip running down the center. It was minimalist and looked almost like a piece of slate. He handed it to the guard. The guard took it, looking annoyed. He glanced at it, ready to dismiss it as a coupon or a business card. Then, he froze. He looked at the card. Then he looked at my father. Then he looked back at the card. The color drained from the guard's face. His posture changed instantly. The aggression vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrified discipline. He quickly swiped the card over a dedicated scanner on his desk, a scanner I had never seen used before. The console let out a soft, melodic chime, and the turnstiles flashed a bright, welcoming green. The guard stepped back, bowing his head slightly. "My apologies, Mr. Wells," the guard said, his voice trembling. "I didn't recognize, please. Right this way. Do you require an escort to the 50th floor?" "No, thank you," my father said, taking the card back and tucking it into his pocket. "I know the way." He walked through the turnstiles. The barriers parted for him smoothly. Sloane's jaw dropped. Vivian looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. "What was that?" Sloane asked, her voice shrill. "That guard stops everyone. He stopped the courier yesterday for wearing sneakers." "I don't know," Vivian said, her voice tight. "But we are going up. Now." My father walked toward us. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Sloane. He just gave me a small nod, a micro gesture that said, I told you so. The private executive elevator arrived. The doors slid open with a whisper. We all stepped inside. The space was small, forcing us into close proximity. The smell of Vivian's perfume was overpowering, cloying in the confined air. My father stood near the control panel. He didn't press a button. He didn't have to. The elevator was programmed to go straight to the executive suite. The ride up took 40 seconds. 40 seconds of suffocating silence. I could hear Graham's breathing shallow and fast. I could see a bead of sweat tracking down the back of his neck. When the doors opened on the 50th floor, the atmosphere was completely different from the lobby. Downstairs was the public face of the company. Upstairs was the war room. The hallway was lined with assistants who were running back and forth with files, looking terrified. The double doors to the main boardroom were closed, guarded by 2 junior lawyers from the firm the Laytons used. Vivian stepped out, regaining her stride. She marched toward the boardroom doors, expecting them to open for her. One of the lawyers, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped in front of her. "Mrs. Layton," he said, "the board is already seated. They are waiting for the presentation." "Fine," Vivian said, adjusting her jacket. "Let us go in." She turned to me. "London, you sit in the back. Frank, you can wait in the reception area. There are magazines on the table." My father didn't move toward the reception area. He stood still, looking at the heavy oak doors. The lawyer looked at his clipboard. "Actually, Mrs. Layton, there is a strict protocol for this session. It is a closed meeting." "I know it is closed," Vivian snapped. "I am the majority shareholder. These are my children, and this," she gestured to me, "is family." "I am sorry," the lawyer said, looking uncomfortable but firm. "The instructions from the creditor committee are specific. Only the named principals of the current debt structure and the primary investors are permitted inside at this time." He looked at me. "Mrs. Gray, I am afraid you are not on the list." Vivian let out a sigh of relief. "Oh, well, that is fine. London, you wait out here. I suppose they don't want the room too crowded." She looked at my father. "And obviously, Frank, you stay here. Try not to touch anything." She turned to Graham and Sloane. "Let's go." Graham paused as he passed me. He leaned in close, his voice a frantic whisper. "I don't know what is happening," he breathed. "The lawyers are acting strange, and Mom is terrified. London, she is shaking. She thinks she can talk her way out of it. But I saw the agenda. It says, change of control. I think we are losing the company." "Graham," Vivian hissed from the doorway. He pulled away, giving me one last look of desperation, and followed his mother into the room. Sloane sashayed past me, smirking. "Don't worry, London. I'll tell you all about it later. Maybe we can get you a job in the mailroom." They walked into the boardroom. The lawyer looked at my father. He didn't ask him to wait. He didn't ask him to leave. He simply stood aside, clearing the path to the door. My father looked at me. "Wait here. London," he said softly. "It won't be long." "Dad," I whispered, "be careful." "I am not the one in danger," he said. He stepped forward. The lawyer reached out and held the heavy door open for him. As my father crossed the threshold, I caught a glimpse of the room inside. I saw the long mahogany table. I saw the bankers in their blue suits. I saw Vivian standing at the head of the table, looking confident, unaware that she was standing on a trapdoor. And then, my father walked into the frame. The lawyer pulled the door shut. Click. The sound of the lock engaging was loud and final. It sounded like the closing of a coffin, or perhaps the opening of a vault. I was left standing in the hallway with the assistants and the silence. I clutched my bag tighter, feeling the sharp edges of the dossier through the leather. They had locked me out. They thought they were keeping the help outside while the adults talked business. But as I looked at the closed door, I realized the truth. They hadn't locked me out. My father had locked them in. He was in there with them, and for the first time in the history of the Layton Harbor Group, the most dangerous person in the room wasn't a Layton. It was the man in the cheap suit. I walked over to a leather bench and sat down. I checked my watch. 9 o'clock exactly. The meeting had begun. I crossed my legs and waited. I knew my time would come. I just had to wait for the scream. The hallway outside Executive Boardroom A was designed to strip you of your confidence. The carpet was a deep, swallowing gray that muffled every footstep, and the walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men who had built the city with steel and ruthlessness. It was a corridor of judgment, and right now, the verdict was hanging heavy in the recycled air. I sat on a low leather bench about 20 feet from the double mahogany doors. My father, Frank, was standing near a floor-to-ceiling window a few yards away, his back to the room, looking out at the sprawling geometry of Chicago. He stood with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, perfectly still. He looked like a man waiting for a train, not a man waiting to face a firing squad. The Laytons, however, could not find stillness. Because of the strict protocol enforced by the mysterious creditor committee, Vivian and Sloane had been forced to wait in the corridor for the final clearance to enter. This was an unprecedented insult. Vivian Layton did not wait in hallways. She made others wait. The delay was only 5 or 10 minutes. But in that time, I watched the veneer of their sophistication begin to crack. Sloane was pacing in tight, angry circles, her heels stabbing into the carpet. She stopped near me, but she looked at my father's back. She needed a target for her anxiety, and he was the easiest one available. "I still don't understand why he's here," Sloane said, her voice pitched loud enough to carry, echoing slightly in the hushed corridor. She turned to Vivian, who was aggressively checking her reflection in a compact mirror. "Did they confuse the invite list? Or maybe the catering staff is short-handed. That must be it. Your dad was probably invited to serve coffee." "London." She let out a short, brittle laugh, looking at me for a reaction. "I mean, look at that suit. It is practically a uniform. I hope he knows how to pour without spilling." I didn't look up from my tablet. I kept my eyes locked on the screen, scrolling through the Apex Horizon invoices one last time. "He has steady hands, Sloane," I said calmly. "Steadier than yours right now." Sloane flushed, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, my hands are fine. I'm just annoyed at the incompetence. We have a company to save, and we are stuck out here with him." Vivian snapped her compact shut with a sharp click. She walked over to where Sloane was standing, smoothing the front of her cream jacket. She cast a glance at my father, her expression a mix of disdain and genuine confusion. "Leave him be, Sloane," Vivian said, her voice dripping with a poisonous kind of pity. "It is actually quite sad. He is trying so hard to be relevant. He probably thinks being here makes him important. Men like that poor, simple men, they always try to mask their inadequacy with silence. They think if they don't speak, no one will notice they have nothing to say. It is pathetic. Really, I feel sorry for him." "Frank, darling," Vivian called out, raising her voice slightly. "Do not worry. If they run out of chairs inside, we can have security bring you a stool." My father didn't turn around. He didn't even flinch. He just kept watching the city, his reflection ghosting against the glass. He was a statue made of patience. "He ignores us because he knows we are right," Sloane sneered. I tightened my grip on the tablet. "They are laughing at the iceberg." I thought, they are dancing on the deck of the Titanic, making fun of the ice, not realizing the hull is already breached. I looked down at the dossier in my lap. The evidence of the fraudulent bookings was right there, glowing in high definition. The email chain where Sloane ordered the fabrication of revenue was on page 4. The proof that Vivian had liquidated the family trust to pay off personal debts was on page 7. They weren't just mean, they were finished. I checked the time. It was 9 o'clock and 3 minutes. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the hallway was broken by the sound of running footsteps. A young man, likely a junior paralegal, came sprinting around the corner from the elevator bank. He was carrying a stack of files that looked too heavy for his thin arms, and his face was slick with sweat. He was clearly late, and in the world of high-stakes corporate law, being late was a capital offense. As he tried to navigate past where Vivian and Sloane were standing, he stumbled. His shoulder brushed against the wall, and the top file from his stack slid off, fluttering through the air like a wounded bird before landing right at my feet. The paralegal gasped, his eyes widening in terror. He dropped to his knees to retrieve it, his hands shaking. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry," he stammered. I reached down and placed my hand on the paper before he could snatch it away. "It is okay," I said softly. But my eyes weren't on his face. They were on the document. It was a cover sheet for a motion to be filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The text was bold, black, and unmistakable. Notice of change of control, immediate actions. Subject Leighton Harbor Group. Action removal of executive board for cause. My heart skipped a beat. For cause. That was legal speak for, "We caught you stealing." The paralegal looked at me, and he saw that I had read it. His face went pale. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't be seen showing you that. Please." He looked terrified, not of me, but of what was happening inside that room. He looked like a man fleeing a burning building. I lifted my hand. "Go," I whispered back. He snatched the paper, scrambled to his feet, and practically ran toward the service entrance, disappearing through a side door. I sat back, my pulse thrumming in my ears. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a restructuring meeting. It was an execution. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from Graham. He had managed to slip inside the boardroom a few minutes ago through a side entrance, claiming he needed to prep the AV system. He was the only Leighton inside the room right now. "Sender Graham. Time 9:05. London. It is bad. It is not just the bank. There are lawyers here I don't recognize, and forensic accountants. Mom hid this from me. They have charts on the wall. London. They have a timeline of the fraud. They are going to eat us alive. Get out of here. Take your dad and leave before the shouting starts." I looked at the message, feeling a strange pang of pity for my husband. He was a coward, yes, but he was also a victim of his mother's machinations. He was standing in the kill box, and he didn't even know who was pulling the trigger. I looked up at Vivian. She was checking her watch, tapping her foot impatiently. "This is ridiculous," she huffed. 9 o'clock was the start time. Do they not know who I am? I have a spa appointment at 11. Maybe they are setting up the coffee station for your dad. Sloane giggled again. Though the laughter sounded forced now, the silence in the hallway was stretching too thin. It was becoming oppressive. 9 o'clock and 7 minutes. The atmosphere shifted. The air pressure seemed to drop. The assistants down the hall stopped typing. The paralegal had vanished. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed to quiet down. Vivian stopped tapping her foot. She looked at the closed double doors. For the first time, her face lost its arrogant set. A flicker of doubt crossed her eyes. "Why is it so quiet in there?" she murmured. Usually, a board meeting starts with the murmur of greetings, the clinking of water glasses, the shuffle of papers, but from behind the mahogany doors, there was absolute silence. It was the silence of a room where the verdict has already been decided. "Maybe they are waiting for us," Sloane said, but her voice wavered. "Maybe we should just knock." "We do not knock, Sloane," Vivian snapped, but she took a half step back from the door. "We are summoned." My father turned away from the window. He walked slowly toward us. He didn't stop at the periphery this time. He walked right into the center of the hallway, standing directly between the Leightons and the door. "You know," my father said, his voice calm and conversational. "My father used to tell me that the hardest part of any job is the waiting, but the second hardest part is the realization that you brought the wrong tools." Vivian glared at him. "What are you babbling about? Frank, go sit down." "I am just saying," he continued, looking at the door handles. "You brought charm. You brought threats. You brought your pedigree, but you didn't bring the money." Vivian's face went purple. "You insolent—" She was cut off by the sound of the lock disengaging. Click. The sound was loud, mechanical, and final. The double doors swung open slowly, revealing the cavernous boardroom inside. The light from the room spilled out into the hallway. blindingly bright compared to the dim corridor, I saw the long table. I saw 12 people sitting around it, men and women in dark suits, their faces grim, their hands folded on top of thick binders. At the far end of the table, the seat of the chairman was empty. Standing at the door was a severe-looking woman with gray hair and glasses. She was the head of the creditor committee's legal team. I recognized her from the news. She was known as the Guillotine. Vivian stepped forward, her smile plastering itself back onto her face instantly. "Ah, finally," Vivian said, smoothing her skirt. "We were beginning to wonder if—" The woman didn't look at Vivian. She didn't look at Sloane. She looked right past them. Her eyes landed on my father. "Mr. Wells," the woman said. Her voice was respectful, clear, and carried the weight of authority. "We are ready for you now." Vivian froze mid-step. Her mouth hung open slightly. Sloane let out a confused noise. "Excuse me, Mr. Wells, I think you mean Mrs. Layton." The lawyer ignored Sloane completely. She stepped back, holding the door wide open. "Bring Mr. Wells in," she repeated to the security guard standing just inside the room. "The board is seated." My father buttoned his jacket, his cheap, charcoal jacket with the stiff shoulders. He looked at Vivian, who was standing there like a statue of shock. "After you, Frank," Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible, her brain unable to process what was happening. "No, Vivian," my father said softly. "Not after me, without me. You don't get in at all." He walked past her. He didn't brush against her, but the wind of his passing seemed to knock the breath out of her lungs. He walked to the doorway. He paused and looked back at me. "London," he said. "Bring the files." I stood up. I clutched the dossier to my chest. I walked past Sloane, who was staring at my father with her mouth open. I walked past Vivian, who looked like she was having a stroke. I walked to the door, standing beside my father. He looked at the room full of bankers and lawyers. Then he looked at me. "Shall we?" he asked. "Let's go," I said. We stepped across the threshold together, leaving the Laytons in the hallway, staring at our backs, as the realization of their doom began to crash down on them like a collapsing building. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, revealing the inner sanctum of the Layton Harbor Group. If the hallway had been a place of judgment, the boardroom was the execution chamber. The air inside was significantly colder than the corridor, conditioned to a temperature that kept adrenaline high and comfort low. The room was dominated by a table that seemed to stretch for a mile, polished to a black mirror finish that reflected the grim faces of the 12 people seated around it. I recognized the players immediately. On the left were the representatives from the Syndicate Bank, men I had seen on the financial news, their ties loosened, their expressions bored but dangerous. On the right were the independent directors, the conscience of the company that Vivian had ignored for years. And at the far end, flanking a projector screen, were 3 lawyers from a firm known for dismantling distressed corporations. There was one chair at the head of the table. It was empty. As we stepped across the threshold, Vivian saw the empty chair. She instinctively moved toward it, her heels sinking into the plush carpet, her body on autopilot. She assumed the seat was hers. She assumed the world still rotated around her axis. But before she could take a step, she paused. Sensing my presence beside her, she leaned in close to me, her voice a razor-thin whisper that barely registered above the hum of the ventilation. "Listen to me. London, I do not know what game your father is playing, but you are going to put a stop to it. If you say one word today that damages this family, if you ruin this deal, you will lose everything. I will make sure you are destitute. Do you hear me?" I stopped. I looked at her. For 3 years, that tone had made my stomach churn. It had made me retreat, apologize, and shrink. But today, standing there with the evidence of her crimes in my bag and the man who owned her debt standing behind me, her voice sounded like nothing more than dry leaves blowing across concrete. "I am not worried about losing anything, Vivian," I said, my voice low and steady. "I lost my respect for you a long time ago, and that was the only thing you ever really had." Vivian recoiled as if I had slapped her. Her eyes widened, shocked by the sudden spine in the creature she thought was an invertebrate. Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Ms. Gray, you are requested." The voice came from a woman standing near the front of the room. She was the corporate secretary, a woman named Ms. Chung, who had served the board for 20 years. She was holding a clipboard, and she wasn't looking at Vivian. She was looking at me. Vivian froze. She whipped her head around to glare at the secretary. "Excuse me," Vivian snapped. "Who authorized you to speak to her? London is here as an observer. She is family. She sits in the back." "Ms. Gray is not here as family." A deep baritone voice interrupted. We all turned. The speaker was the lead attorney for the creditor group, a man with silver hair and a suit that cost more than my entire education. He was standing near the window, reviewing a document. He didn't even look up as he spoke. "Who authorized this?" Vivian demanded, her voice rising an octave. "I am the majority shareholder. I decide who sits at this table. This is a private board session. It is not a family reunion." "Mrs. Layton," the lawyer said, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, devoid of sympathy. "And as of 9 o'clock this morning, your status as majority shareholder is under review. Ms. Gray, please take the seat to the right of the projection screen. We will need your input on the exhibits." Vivian stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. She looked at Graham, who was cowering in a chair near the wall, looking like he wanted to dissolve into the drywall. She looked at Sloane, who was standing by the door, stripped of her usual snark, looking terrified. I walked past Vivian. I didn't make eye contact. I walked to the head of the room and placed my heavy leather tote bag on the table. I pulled out the dossier, the thick, stapled stack of papers containing the forensic audit, the fake invoices, and the emails. Thud. The sound of the dossier hitting the table was loud in the silence. It sounded like a gavel. I took my seat. I folded my hands on top of the files. I looked at the bankers. They nodded at me. They knew who I was. They knew what I had brought. My father, Frank, did not sit. He stayed near the door, leaning casually against the wall next to a ficus tree. He looked like a bodyguard, or perhaps a shadow. He watched the room with the same calm, analytical gaze he used to troubleshoot a diesel engine. He was checking the pressure. He was listening for the knock. Vivian, realizing she had lost control of the seating chart, scrambled to a chair on the opposite side of the table. She sat down, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "Fine," she said, her voice brittle. "Let us get this over with. We are here to discuss the restructuring of the debt facility. I have spoken to the bank, and we are prepared to offer. We are not here to negotiate. Mrs. Layton," the bank representative cut in. He was a younger man, sharp-featured, with eyes like flint. "We are here to execute." "Execute what?" Sloane asked from the back, her voice shaking. The lawyer with the silver hair stepped forward. He placed a single sheet of paper in the center of the table. 30 days ago," the lawyer began, his voice measuring out the doom in precise increments. "The Layton Harbor Group was served with a notice of acceleration regarding the syndicate loan totaling $250 million. The terms were clear: immediate repayment in full due to a breach of the debt covenants." "We did not breach," Vivian cried out, gripping the edge of the table. "Our revenue numbers are solid. The hotel occupancy is at 85%. I sent you the reports myself." I touched the dossier under my hand. I felt the heat of the lie radiating through the paper. "The reports were received," the lawyer said calmly, "and they were analyzed, which brings us to the second matter, fraud." The word hung in the air like toxic smoke. Graham put his head in his hands. Sloane let out a small whimper. "That is a lie," Vivian hissed. "How dare you? We are a legacy company. We do not commit fraud." "The numbers do not lie, Mrs. Layton," the lawyer said. "But we are not here to litigate the fraud today. That will be a matter for the authorities later. We are here to discuss the debt." He paused. letting the threat of prison settle over Vivian's shoulders before delivering the final blow. Because the bank identified the collateral as distressed and the borrower as high risk, the bank exercised its right to sell the debt obligation on the secondary market. As of 3 days ago, the First Commercial Bank of Chicago no longer holds your mortgage. Vivian blinked. Did you sell the loan? We did, the banker confirmed. We divested. To whom? Vivian asked, a flicker of hope sparking in her eyes. Who bought it? Is it Blackstone? Is it a hedge fund? I can talk to them. I can explain the brand value. We can work out a payment plan. She was desperate. She thought she could charm a hedge fund manager. She thought she could schmooze her way out of a $250 million hole. The debt was purchased in its entirety, the lawyer said, consulting his file, by a private holding company, Redwood Proxy LLC. Redwood. Vivian frowned. I have never heard of them. Who are they? Get them on the phone. I want to speak to the principal. The principal is present, the lawyer said. Vivian looked around the room. She looked at the bankers. She looked at the independent directors. She looked at the lawyers. Where, she demanded. I don't see anyone new. I sat perfectly still. I watched my father. He pushed himself off the wall. He adjusted his cuffs. He walked slowly toward the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair Vivian had tried to claim. The room went silent. The only sound was the soft thud of his old shoes on the carpet. He pulled out the chair. He didn't sit immediately. He stood behind it, his hands resting on the leather backrest. Vivian watched him, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning, horrific realization. Frank, she whispered, what are you doing? Get away from there. That is the chairman's seat. The silver-haired lawyer turned to Vivian. He gestured toward my father with an open hand, a gesture of deference. Mrs. Layton, the lawyer said, his voice ringing with formal finality. Representing the creditor group and the sole owner of Redwood Proxy LLC, may I introduce Mr. Frank Wells. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy. It was the sound of a universe collapsing. Sloane gasped, a loud, ugly sound. You have got to be kidding me. Vivian stared at Frank. She looked at his cheap suit. She looked at his face, which she had mocked only 12 hours ago. She looked at the man she had called a peasant. No, she breathed. That is impossible. He is a mechanic. He fixes trains. He doesn't have $200 million. I fixed trains for 40 years, Vivian, my father said. His voice was calm, devoid of triumph, which made it all the more devastating. And I saved my money, and I invested it, and I had friends who knew how to make it grow. Compound interest is a powerful thing when you don't spend it on parties and appearance. He looked down at the table, running a finger along the polished wood. But you are right, he continued. I didn't have $200 million. I had enough to buy the debt for pennies on the dollar, because the bank knew what you refused to admit. They knew this company was worthless. They sold it to me for scrap value. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. I bought you for scrap, Vivian. This is illegal, Vivian shrieked, standing up. He can't do this. This is a conflict of interest. He is my in-law. It is a business transaction, the lawyer interjected smoothly. And under the terms of the loan agreement, specifically the change of control clause triggered by the covenant default, Mr. Wells now has the right to appoint an interim board of directors and seize operational control of the assets. You are stealing my company, Vivian screamed. I am repossessing my collateral, my father corrected her. There is a difference. He finally sat down in the chairman's seat. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. Now, Frank said, clasping his hands on the table. We have a lot of work to do. But first, we need to address the reason why the bank sold the debt in the first place. He turned his gaze to me. London, he said. I believe you have some documents to share with the board regarding the occupancy figures. I opened the dossier. I felt the gaze of everyone in the room on me. Vivian was looking at me with pure hatred. Graham was looking at me with sorrow. Sloane was looking at the floor. "Yes, Mr. Chairman," I said, the title tasting sweet on my tongue. I slid the first sheet of paper across the black granite. "This is an email dated November 12th, I began, my voice clear and projecting to the back of the room. "From the Director of Brand Strategy, instructing general managers to fabricate guest records." Vivian lunged across the table. "London, stop, don't you dare." "Sit down, Mrs. Layton," the security guard barked. Stepping forward, Vivian fell back into her chair, defeated. She looked at me, and her eyes were pleading now. "We are family. London, don't do this." I looked at her. I thought about the post-nup. I thought about the insults. I thought about how she had made me feel small for 3 years. "I am doing exactly what you asked, Vivian," I said coldly. "You told me to protect the brand. I am protecting it. From you." I pushed the rest of the files into the center of the table. "The numbers don't lie," I said. "And neither do I." My father nodded. He picked up the file I had slid to him. He put on a pair of reading glasses, drugstore readers that probably cost $10. He looked at the document, then looked at Sloane. "Sloane," he said gently, "I think you might want to start clearing out your desk. Security will escort you." The punch had landed. It wasn't thrown with a fist. It was thrown with paper, patience, and a cheap suit, and the impact was absolute. The Layton Empire hadn't just been breached, it had been conquered. The shock in the room was a physical force, sucking the oxygen out of the air and leaving a vacuum that only Sloane's shrill voice dared to fill. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor, her manicured finger pointing accusingly at my father, who was now comfortably seated at the head of the table. "This is a joke," Sloane spat, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an ally who would share in her indignation. "Is this some kind of sick prank? Look at him. Look at his cuffs. He is wearing a suit from a thrift store. You are telling me this. This mechanic is the new majority creditor. He probably doesn't even know what EBITDA means." She turned to the bank representatives, her face flushed with a desperate, ugly entitlement. "Throw him out. Security, why is everyone just sitting here?" The silence that answered her was deafening. The security guard did not move. The bankers did not look up from their files. My father, Frank Wells, didn't even blink. He reached into the inside pocket of that despised charcoal jacket. He pulled out a thick, folded document bound in blue legal paper. He slid it across the polished black granite until it came to rest directly in front of the lead attorney. "I may not know every buzzword you learned in business school, Sloane," my father said, his voice level and calm, cutting through her hysteria like a knife through water. "But I know how to read a contract. And I know that when you sign your name to a loan, you give your word, and when you break your word, you lose your seat." The attorney picked up the document. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the cover page. "This is the deed of assignment," the attorney announced to the room, his voice devoid of emotion. "Certified by the state of Illinois and the Federal Banking Commission. It confirms that Redwood Proxy LLC has acquired 100% of the senior secured debt obligations of Layton Harbor Group. The transfer of funds was verified at 8 o'clock this morning." He looked up, meeting Vivian's terrified gaze. "Mr. Wells is not a guest. Mrs. Layton, he is the bank." Vivian slumped back in her chair as if her strings had been cut. Her face was ashen, the makeup standing out like paint on a corpse. She looked at my father, really looked at him for the first time in 3 years. She searched his face for the simple, blue-collar man she thought she knew, but she found only a stranger with eyes like steel. "Who are you?" Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. "We checked you. We ran a background check when London married Graham. You were nobody. You were a retired laborer. Who are you really?" My father leaned forward, clasping his rough, calloused hands on the expensive table. "I am exactly who I said I was. Vivian," he said softly, "I am a father. I am a grandfather to the children London might have one day. And I am the man you laughed at last night because his shoes were scuffed. You were so busy looking at the price tag, you forgot to look at the value. At that precise moment, a side door near the front of the room, the one leading to the executive secretariat, swung wide open. Ms. Chung, the corporate secretary who had been silent until now, stepped forward. She held a heavy ceremonial gavel in one hand and a digital tablet in the other. She looked at the Laytons, then turned her back on them to face my father. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of profound professional respect. "Mr. Wells," she said, her voice clear and formal, echoing off the mahogany walls. "The boardroom is ready. The agenda is yours." It was the final key turning in the lock. The room belonged to him. My father nodded to her. He picked up the gavel. He didn't bang it. He just held it, feeling the weight of the authority that had shifted. "Thank you," he said. "Let us begin. The first order of business is restructuring. This company has been run like a private piggy bank for too long. We are not here to destroy Layton Harbor. We are here to clean it. That means we are cutting the rot out." "Rot?" Vivian gasped, finding a shred of her old arrogance. "I built this brand. I am the soul of this company." "You are the liability," my father corrected her. "And you are not the only one." He turned his eyes to me. "London? The evidence?" I stood up. I didn't feel fear anymore. I didn't feel the need to hide. I felt the cool clarity of justice. I picked up my tablet and synced it with the main projector screen. "Exhibit C," I said. The huge screen behind my father flickered to life. A spreadsheet appeared, dense with numbers, followed by a series of scanned emails. The font was blown up large enough for everyone to see. "These are the internal communication logs from the marketing department," I explained, my voice steady. "Specifically, a directive from Sloan Layton ordering the creation of phantom bookings to inflate the Q4 revenue report. This was done to prevent a credit freeze. It is a direct violation of the loan covenants, and under federal law, it constitutes wire fraud." Sloan went pale. She scrambled to cover the screen with her hand, realizing too late that she was 20 feet away from it. "That is out of context," she shrieked. "I was brainstorming. That wasn't an order." "It is signed. Sloan," I said, pointing to the digital signature at the bottom of the email. "And here are the invoices from Apex Horizon. The money went out, circled through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, and came back in as room revenue. I traced the IP address of the shell company. It was registered to a laptop in your office." The independent directors gasped. The bankers began scribbling furiously in their notebooks. This was no longer a business dispute. This was a crime scene. "This calls for an immediate forensic audit," the lead banker stated, his face grim, "and the immediate suspension of the officers involved." "Agreed," my father said. He turned his gaze to Graham. My husband was sitting with his head in his hands, shaking. "Graham," my father said, his voice losing its hardness, returning to the tone of a disappointed parent. "You signed those reports too. Your name is on the compliance certificates." Graham looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. He looked at his mother, who was staring at him with a silent command to deny everything. Then he looked at me. For a moment, the room hung in suspension. Graham Layton had a choice. He could be the son, or he could be the man. He stood up. His legs were shaky, but he stood. Graham started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. "I signed them, yes." Vivian let out a strangled cry. "Graham, shut up." "No, Mom," Graham said, turning to her, tears streaming down his face. "I am done. I can't do it anymore. I can't live like this." He turned to the board, then to me. "I was coerced," Graham said quietly. "My mother told me that if I didn't sign, the family would lose everything. She said London would leave me if I was poor. She made me choose between my integrity and my marriage." He looked at me, his expression full of a tragic, belated apology. "I am sorry. London, I should have protected you. I was just so scared of her." "I know," I whispered. The silver-haired lawyer stood up. In light of the admission of guilt and the documentary evidence provided by Ms. Gray, I move for a vote on the immediate removal of Vivian Layton as CEO and the termination of Sloan Layton for cause. I further move for the appointment of an interim management team selected by the primary creditor. Seconded, said the bank representative. All in favor? My father asked. Every hand in the room went up. The independent directors, the bankers, the lawyers, even the corporate secretary raised her hand. Vivian sat frozen, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, watching her empire dissolve by a unanimous show of hands. The motion carries, my father said. He signed the order that Ms. Chung placed in front of him. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. He capped the pen and looked up at Vivian. Security, he said calmly. Please escort the former CEO and the former brand director from the building. Their access passes are to be deactivated immediately. 2 guards stepped forward. Vivian stood up, trembling with a rage that was terrifying to behold. She looked at my father, her eyes burning with hatred. You think you have won. Frank, she hissed. You are still just a peasant in a cheap suit. You will never belong in this room. My father stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked around the table until he was standing face to face with her. He was not a tall man, but in that moment, he towered over her. Vivian, he said, his voice low and heavy with finality. You spent your whole life thinking that class is about what you wear and where you summer. You taught my daughter to be ashamed of where she came from. You taught your own son to be a liar. He leaned in closer. I may wear a cheap suit, he said, but I paid for it. I earned it. And tonight, I will sleep with a clear conscience. I taught you shame today. Vivian, I hope you learn to wear it better than you wear your diamonds. He signaled the guards. Get them out, Vivian screamed as the guards took her arms. Sloan was sobbing, begging for a severance package as she was dragged toward the door. The sound of their exit faded down the hallway, leaving a profound, cleansing silence in the boardroom. Graham remained standing. He looked at me. London, he said softly. What happens now? I reached into my bag and pulled out the post-nuptial agreement Vivian had tried to force me to sign the night before. I held it up. This happens, I said. I tore the document in half, then in half again. I dropped the pieces on the black granite table. I am not signing anything, Graham, and I'm not staying in a marriage built on fear. You have a lot of work to do. You have to figure out who you are when you aren't Vivian Layton's son. Maybe, if you find that man, give me a call. But until then, I took off my wedding ring. It was a heavy diamond, chosen by Vivian, paid for by the company. I placed it on top of the torn papers. I am resigning from the role of the dutiful wife. I turned to my father. He was watching me with pride shining in his eyes. Ready to go, Dad? I asked. I think our work here is done. I think so, Frank said. He turned to the interim CEO he had just appointed. You have your orders. Clean the books. Pay the staff. Run an honest business. I'll be watching. Yes, Mr. Chairman, the executive said. My father and I walked out of the boardroom together. We walked past the stunned assistants in the hallway. We walked past the empty office that used to belong to Sloan. We took the elevator down to the lobby. As we stepped out into the cold, bright Chicago morning, the wind hit my face, but it didn't feel biting anymore. It felt fresh. It felt like freedom. My father put his arm around my shoulders. He was still wearing the charcoal suit. The shoulders were still stiff. The shoes were still scuffed, but as we walked down the street, people stepped aside to let him pass. They didn't know he owned the building behind us. They didn't know he had just toppled a dynasty. They just saw a man walking with his head held high, and a daughter who had finally learned that the strongest table is the one you build yourself. So, my father said, checking his old wristwatch. It is 10:30, too early for lunch. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that came from deep in my chest. Dad, you just bought a corporation. I think we can afford early lunch. My treat. Good, he smiled. I know a place. great burgers, and you don't need a reservation. We walked away from the shadow of Leighton Tower, stepping into the sun. The revenge was sweet, but the victory wasn't about the money or the power. It was about the truth, and the truth was, a cheap suit covers a good man just as well as an expensive one covers a monster. We had stripped the monster bare, and all that was left was the wind. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening on your commute, at the gym, or maybe relaxing at home? Please drop a comment below and let me know your location and what you thought of Frank's master plan. If you enjoyed this takedown, please subscribe to Maya Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story get heard by even more people. Your support means the world to us.